So Cassandra, starting with pardons, President Joe Biden has announced fairly recently a pardon. We don't have that in Britain. There's been a long-running issue of criminalisation for cannabis. We know that black people are far more likely to be arrested and indeed prosecuted, up to 12 times more likely to be prosecuted in the UK for cannabis. This has destroyed a lot of lives. Clearly, when it comes to criminal convictions, it impacts more on black people than it does on white people. So, when you learn that Britain is very much behind the United States on this one, what's your reaction, and why is it important that there is a pardon, that people who've been convicted, for example, just of possession, are able to move on with their lives?
I appreciate the question. I mean, I think that one of the things that we think is really crucial when it comes to decriminalization and for the regulation of cannabis is that we need to make sure that whatever harms happened in the past are addressed in present policy. That we can't just decide to stop doing a behavior, that the people that have been harmed before need to feel full restitution in their ability to be full participants in society. And criminal justice records can often impede someone's ability to be a full participant in society. And so as we build this conversation around cannabis reform in the UK, conversations about restitution for people that have been criminalized needs to be centered in how the conversation moves forward.
And I guess it's one thing to talk about, wiping away criminal convictions, but we need to stop the flow of black people going into. We know that there's a problem, particularly in the Metropolitan Police, when it comes to police using stopping and searching because their noses tell them that they can smell cannabis. Quite often there is no cannabis, not quite sure what the police's noses are actually telling them in the first place. I interviewed the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, the new one, fairly recently, Sir Mark Rowley. I asked him this question, are you going to stop police stopping, or officers stopping people on the streets because they smell cannabis? And he rather fudged that question. Given that we don't have at the moment any real signals from the police hierarchy that they want to stop searching people simply for a smell of cannabis, what's your reaction to that? How important is it that this problem is dealt with and solved at root?
One of the things that is super crucial for people to understand is that cannabis reform inherently is policing reform. And that unless we deal with the root cause of the way that cannabis enforcement is done, which is through policing, if we are not working on building a campaign and building power in communities about changing the way that law enforcement engages with citizens, it's important for then we're not going to actually get cannabis reform. Right? If cannabis reform cannot be divorced from policing reform, they are one and of the same. And it's actually critical for stop and search reform to happen, regardless of cannabis. One of the key factors of cannabis reform in New York was that it was done in conjunction with the policing reform community. Cannabis activists were a part of the policing reform community and a part of the legislation and a part of that advocacy. We used cannabis as a reason why you should stop and search, but it was not the only reason that we wanted to stop and search. If we had gotten cannabis reform, but stop and search was still in place in New York, I would not consider it a win. So it's really critical for stop and search to be a key component and a framework for us to talk about cannabis reform.
What does cannabis reform look like?
Cannabis reform for me should serve as a platform and a leverage for us to have a conversation about the ways that our society wants to be in community. So that looks like, for me, what are the things that cannabis reform also touches? We just talked about policing. Cannabis reform is a part of policing, but it's also a part of ways that criminal justice histories impact someone's ability to be a part of full participation in a community. I think there's also the conversation about who is able to be a part of the cannabis industry. What is the restitution due to communities that have been targeted by cannabis enforcement? As we're moving into this place, how do we have the institutions atone for what they did to our communities, but also how do we make sure it never happens again? And how do we make sure that the behavior and enforcement that happened with cannabis doesn't show up in another place?
What kind of restitution are we talking about? Are we talking about something, added to the reparations debate, or are we talking about something quite separate? There's a question about how you calculate harm to the community and, of course, somebody's career path, for example, and who should pay?
Yeah. So I think the conversation of restitution is community focused, right? The community needs to do an accounting of what the harms were of cannabis prohibition and enforcement, and figure out, based on the harm, how comprehensive the harm is, should be how comprehensive the restitution is, right? I can't speak sophisticatedly about the UK system. I can speak to the US system because I'm very clear about how cannabis enforcement has impacted people's ability to be full participants in society. So cannabis enforcement in the US prohibits your ability to be a part of social housing. It can get you deported. You can lose custody of your kid. You can lose financial aid for university. Those are all things that we would account as harm, and that should be a part of any restitution processes. I also think that it's really important for us to figure out where the monies go that the cities generate from the legalization of cannabis. How is that being invested in? Especially since it's from community in which regulation will happen. And so community should benefit from that decision, considering that it was government who created the problem of enforcement and prohibition. And then I think the people that do the harm should be the ones that pay. And so for that, this is a systematic issue, and the system should figure out ways. If they can find the ways to arrest you, then they can find the ways to repair you, and they can find the ways to invest in your community and do the repair.
When it comes to the cannabis market, certainly we're looking at the amount of money that the medicinal cannabis is worth. It's growing exponentially each year. There are predictions that the UK market, as it is before any legalisation, could actually be worth I think £1 billion by 2026. Huge amounts of money. If we do get decriminalisation, legalisation, it would be worth a lot more than that, presumably. I know that certain states, have decriminalised cannabis. What's been the experience there in relation to black entrepreneurs getting a hold of that market? And ask that question, in the context that when it comes to the current market, just in relation to medicinal, cannabis, I see no evidence that the black community, that black entrepreneurs, have got that market. That market seems to be going, for example, to sugar corporates that are getting into it. We're very much cut out of that. I assume that one of the things that you want to see is black entrepreneurs getting hold of what could be, what is, and what will certainly be a very lucrative market into the future.
I think it's really critical for us to think about the economic opportunities and what does economic justice and cannabis reform look like. I think it's really critical for us to explore different regulatory models that are not just based in commercialization and capitalism. I think we should look at what are opportunities for communities of color, communities and countries that have been negatively impacted by cannabis enforcement to be able to be significant portions of the distributors and retail in the cannabis industry. I think it's one of the things that we're working on in the States is to get more black ownership, more black participation, and more black power in the space.
But what does that look like in practice? Is it about kind of caucusing? Is it about getting people who want to get into the market together to work out when those opportunities come, how to be at the front of the queue? In a practical sense, are there certain things that people who are thinking about this as getting into this market need to be doing at this stage?
I think people need to be researching, but also figuring out what is it that you want your cannabis regulation model to look like. In the States, we have a lot of Black entrepreneurs that are doing education, that are pooling together resources to build for licenses. There are conversations in places about how do we prioritize licenses for communities disproportionately impacted by enforcement so that they can get licenses first. I think there are a multitude of strategies. I think the thing that we're learning in the States is that navigating regulation and capitalism is very difficult, and the overwhelming possibility is that it will go the way that it always goes, right? And that often is cutting Black folks out. However, this industry is very different, because the reason this industry exists is because we did the advocacy based on our pain. And so how do we create opportunities and try different strategies around prioritization, around different kinds of licenses? How do we make sure that that capital goes down? What is the government's responsibility to provide funding for new entrepreneurs? These are all things that we should explore, and I think it's critical for Black folks in the UK to be talking to Black folks in the US to think about, like, okay, what is working for them, what is not working for them, to inform the debate here.